Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our October 28th edition of our Behavioral Health webinar series, Helping the Helpers and Those They Serve, jointly sponsored by the Behavioral Health Administration and MedChi. I am Steve Whitfield, the Medical Director of the Behavioral Health Administration, and I'll be subbing in for Dr. Jones as our host tonight. Our interpreter is Alita Hill, so thank you as always, Alita. And thanks to all of you for taking this time to pay attention to your self-care and hear about tonight's topic, putting your self-care on a pedestal. Why, as healthcare workers, don't we do better with making our self-care a high priority? We spend a lot of time advising those in our care how they should take care of themselves, but practicing what we preach can be a different matter. To borrow from that common analogy of the oxygen mask dropping in an airplane, we do not always put our masks on first and to avoid passing out before assisting others who need help with their masks. We went into healthcare due to desire to help others, but if we ignore our self-care in the end, we may not be able to give our best. Your self-care is important enough to be on a pedestal, as tonight's speaker will inform us. So as always, please put your questions into the Q&A. Feel free to share in the chat about how you're doing, challenges you may be facing, in addition to sharing reactions to what this speaker is presenting. And if you're dealing with grief, depression, insomnia, compassion fatigue, microaggressions, other issues, the videos of our previous webinars are available as a resource on the webinar website. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening, Dr. Hinda Dubin. I've reached out to Dr. Dubin many times for participating in our webinar. In fact, she holds the record for the most times being the moderator or speaker. So I'm glad she keeps taking my phone calls. So thank you, Dr. Dubin. And also, Dr. Dubin is a university acclaimed psychiatrist. I added that to her bio. It didn't come from her, but it's really true. She's just so wonderful. So she's received her BA from the Johns Hopkins University in Humanistic Studies with honors. She then completed her medical training and residency in psychiatry at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, where she served as a faculty member for many years. And she also served as the coordinator of cognitive behavioral therapy training. Currently, she is the BHA coordinator of the Psychiatric Education and Training Program there and the Associate Training Director for the University of Maryland Sheppard Pratt Psychiatry Residency Training Program. Dr. Dubin is a founding fellow of the Academy of Cognitive Therapy and a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. Dr. Dubin has received numerous teaching awards, including the Clinician Teacher of the Year Award and the prestigious Walter Weintraub Award for Teaching Excellence. She's lectured internationally on cognitive behavioral therapy and also on women's mental health issues throughout the life cycle. She has a private practice in Baltimore, and her areas of expertise include cognitive behavioral therapy, mood and anxiety disorders, and women's mental health issues. I will now turn it over to Dr. Dubin.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Whitfield, for that very, very warm introduction. I want to thank Dr. Whitfield and Dr. Jones of the Behavioral Health Administration, who in association with the MedChi put self-care on such a pedestal. They are trying, as Dr. Bartley will explain to us, to tell us how important that is. And in that service, we've had all these seminars this year, and I encourage you, as Dr. Whitfield mentioned, to go back and look at them. And he's really done an amazing job of putting this program together. Seriously, you are in for a treat tonight, I have to say. David Woods Bartley, who is our speaker today, has seen his fair share of successes and setbacks, from directing a nationally recognized nonprofit to battling a life-threatening mental illness. The latter, as he would say, a brutal knockdown, drag-out fight with clinical depression led David to a suicide attempt. Thanks to the support of a great many people and being shown the necessity of putting your self-care on a pedestal, like that beautiful image in front of you, David continues the important yet still challenging journey from the isolation of mental illness to mental wellness. His life having been saved, David is committed to moving the conversation about mental illness and suicide from the dark shadows where they now live to the forefront of public concern. And in that regard, you do know that us as healthcare providers are at a greater risk for suicidal thoughts, burnout, and behavior. And in doing so, he has really made it his mission to shine a bright light on the crisis we now face and open doors to the possibility of mental health for everyone. And isn't that what we're all about? Currently, David is a member of the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, the International Association for Youth Mental Health, the National Storytelling Network's Healing Story Alliance, and Active Minds. It's amazing how much he gets done in a day. He also holds certifications in mental health first aid for adults and youth, Safe Talk, suicide awareness for everyone, and the suicide prevention technique known as QPR, question, persuade, and refer. In addition, he has given 2 TED Talks and has been named a 2021 mental health champion by the prestigious Steinberg Institute. He has presented more than 500 times to audience across the United States, Canada, Central America, and India, giving in-person and virtual presentations on mental health, suicide awareness and prevention, organizational culture, and leadership. He has been invited to present to the United States Army, the Food and Drug Administration, LSH of India, Sutter Health, Able2, the California Highway Patrol, and the list goes on and on, including the Indiana Organization for Nursing Leadership and the California North State School of Medicine. He's also spoken at a wide range of high schools, middle schools, community organizations, and diverse faith denominations. It is really a privilege and a delight, and I cannot wait to hear his presentation. A few quick housekeeping issues right before that. If you have questions, as Dr. Whitfield said, please put them in the Q&A or share them in the chat. You have a choice. You can put the questions so that everyone can see them, or put it so that just the host and panelists can see them. We will try to answer as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. I also would like you to be aware that this webinar is recorded, and later on, Dr. Whitfield will put in the chat about achieving CME for the presentation. Without further ado, I can't tell you what a great honor it is for me to call on David Woods Bartley to give his presentation.
Dr. Dubin, thank you. I will say that that is probably the finest introduction I have ever had. And before I begin, I want to begin with a thank you. That of all the talks that I'm blessed to give, when I have an opportunity to speak to the courageous souls who are in behavioral health, this is my favorite, because you are the ones that saved my life. And it doesn't matter that I never sat with you. It doesn't matter that I wasn't part of a county system of care in Maryland, where I grew up, quite by the way. It's still you who saved my life. And I never want you to forget that everything that you do makes an extraordinary difference. And so I just want to give you a little idea on what we're going to talk about this evening. These are the learning objectives. And if I was to summarize them, it's really just to enhance what both Dr. Whitfield had said, what Dr. Jones I know was passionate for, what Dr. Dubin said. It's all about self-care. Self-care saves my life. It continues to save my life. And I think that given how hard you work, all that you do for people like me, I want to remind you of things that, quite frankly, you already know, but maybe you've forgotten about them. Maybe you don't realize how important it is and how selfless it is for you to prioritize your self-care. So for about the first 10 minutes, I'm going to tell you a brief version of my story, and then highlight what I think one of the most influential things is that damages Dr. Dubin, there'll be no data. I'm not going to do there's no pie chart. There's nothing like that. It's really all about story. And my story begins on August 31st, 2011. And I just celebrated a 10-year anniversary from this day. And it's really an anniversary of living, because August 31st, 2011 was the day that I was going to kill myself. It was the day that, as I call the monster of clinical depression, after trying for close to 40 years, he finally on that day convinced me that indeed I was worthless, that I was useless, that I was stupid, that I was pitiful, that I was weak, that I wasn't a man by any measure, that I was grotesque and ugly, that I had become an embarrassment and a burden. And the straw that broke my psychological back, my mental back, my spiritual back, was what I believed on that particular day was that everybody in my then life, former wife Deanna, family, friends, that they'd all be better off without me, that they'd be better off if I would just kill myself. And so on that particular day, I remember waking up here in Northern California at the end of August. There's no chance of rain, and it was a beautiful day. And I walked around this 2.5 acre parcel that Deanna and I owned, and then I sat down at the computer and I typed out my suicide note. Dear Deanna, I have decided that the time has come for me to go. I am choosing to end my life so that I can be free of the pain in my heart and soul, the betrayal of my mind, and the depth of self-hatred that I feel. I have become a burden I wish I never would, and a drag on those around me. I am a damaged shell of a boy, not yet close to the man I should be. Everyone will be much better off without me. I am so very sorry. Then I took the note off the printer, and then I made the short 20-minute drive from where Deanna and I were living in a little town called Penryn, just outside of Sacramento in Northern California, to the Forest Hill Bridge. Now, of course, everybody knows the Golden Gate Bridge, and the Forest Hill Bridge is just about 2 hours east. But the Forest Hill Bridge at 730 feet tall is 500 feet further off the ground than its more famous cousin. And this was not the first time I had been to the bridge. At 48 years old then, I had been plagued by suicidal ideations for close to 4 decades. And I had been to the bridge. I had been to the bridge so many times, in fact, that on this day, I knew exactly where I would park. And so I brought my red Dodge Dakota pickup truck to this spot, turned off the ignition, sat there for just a moment, and then closed my eyes and took this deep breath. Opened my eyes, reached over, grabbed the suicide note, placed that right in the center of the dash. Keys out of the ignition, those in the center of the note. Exit the vehicle and have this thought, I got to make sure that the door's unlocked. Turn around. Yes, it is. Turn back around, cross over the road, and then come to the closest end of the bridge deck. Now, the bridge at 2,000 feet long is just short of a half mile. And you can see from either side, the view is spectacular. But on that day, the monster had given me a paper towel roll. And all I could see was the light post standing at the very midpoint, at the highest point of the bridge above the North Fork of the American River, 1,000 feet away. And so I made my way to that light post, only seeing that, turned to my left without looking up, bent over, the suicide barrier hitting me right across the chest, and then moved my body to, it was almost like a teeter-totter, just balancing on that rail, still looking through a paper towel roll now at the river. And in that moment, my thoughts are spinning to the point where it pushed out the reality of time. And I say that because I don't know how long I was in this pose, teetering on the literal verge of death. But thankfully, it was long enough for somebody passing by, looking upon the scene, realizing something's not right with this picture, picking up the phone, calling 911, and a first responder, a deputy sheriff from Placer County, approached me from the left-hand side and did 2 things. First thing he did is establish contact, which is logistical. But then he created connection, which is life-saving, because connection creates hope, and hope saves lives. I was taken off the bridge to an emergency department and then to a psych ward, a nut house, a loony bin. At least that's what I thought, because at 48 years old, not only had I never been to a psych ward, I didn't know anyone who'd been to psych ward. And at 48, all I could think about was Jack Nicholson and One Flew Over a Cuckoo's Nest, and that I'm never going to get there. Added to the fact that what my confusion was, when the EMT in the back of the ambulance says, you're going to a good place, you're going to the Puff, I thought, well, I guess we're going to an opium den and we're just going to smoke marijuana and everything's going to be okay. Well, a Puff in California, maybe it's the same in Maryland, is a psychiatric health facility, any psych ward with less than 16 beds. And when I was there, and then people found out I was there, to say that they were confused would be like the greatest understatement of all time, because people didn't see me as mentally ill. They didn't see me as clinically depressed. They didn't see me at a high risk for suicide. No, they saw me as one half of a very committed couple that ran an extraordinary animal sanctuary called A Chance for Bliss. And if you love animals, you would have loved the sanctuary. Dee and I ran this for a great many years, and the sanctuary was home to as many as 100 animals at any one time. 25 horses, 23 dogs, 9 potbelly pigs, goats and sheep and ducks and geese and bunnies and birds, this whole collection, this representation, a Noah-like experience on this little 2.5 acre parcel. And we wanted the throwaways, the unadoptables, the ones due to age or condition or anything like that, the ones at the end of life. And so we did no adoptions. We were a forever home for these unwanted companion animals. And on June 2nd, 2010, we were the cover story in the life section of USA Today. I didn't fit the image. I didn't fit the definition. I didn't appear to be mentally ill, suicidal. But as you know, sometimes what hurts the most can't be seen. Sometimes great despair, soul-crushing, hope-killing agony lies just behind a forced smile, a distracting joke, or in this case, a seemingly perfect and ideal life. And because I was a great actor, because I could hide behind the velocity of my life, not even my former beloved knew the place of hopelessness. And just 14 short months after this mountaintop on the very verge of death. But life had other plans. And on a day I thought would be my last day alive, it was instead the first day of this brand new life. And the first steps in what is now been a 10-year journey, as Dr. Dubin says, away from mental illness and into the experience that you remind us what our right is to be mentally well, to be mentally healthy. And that's my story, the short version of it. And because you saved my life, I'd like to offer something back to you, this reminder of the importance of self-care. Self-care continues to save my life because I would love to be in front of you today, having this great honor and privilege to say I've never had another thought of depression. I've never felt like the monster is breathing his acrid breath down on me. I'd love to tell you I've never had another thought of killing myself, that it still happens. But they're days, they're not weeks, they're not months, and they're not years. Self-care continues to keep me alive, to keep me well. And I want to talk about it. But the first thing I want to talk about before I jump to the solution is to talk about what I think in your world, if I may, what one of the most primary influences that degrades your well-being. And it is this exposure to trauma. And before I read this quote from Dr. Figley, which I think is a beautiful quote that underscores this dilemma, is the understanding that trauma is trauma. Trauma is personal. And I think one of the reasons that we don't fully process the impact of trauma in our life is that we minimize it. We think, well, there are children starving in Africa. There are children who are suffering from the effects of self-trafficking, all these other things. But if we don't process the experience of our own trauma, whatever it is, it will become cumulative, and it will ultimately continue to be a drag on our self-care and impacts our efficacy to not just in our professional lives, but in the efficacy of we being a human being, of we being able to enjoy all these aspects of life that we have an inalienable right because we are born into this experience, however we define that. So if I may, I'll read the quote that from Dr. Figley that really speaks about you, that we have not been directly exposed to the trauma scene, but we hear the story with such intensity, or we hear some similar stories so often, or we have the gift and the curse of extreme empathy, and we suffer. We feel the feelings of our clients. We experience their fears. We dream their dreams. And eventually we lose a certain spark of optimism, humor, and hope. We tire. We aren't sick, but we aren't ourselves. I did a calculation recently. I have been in more than 300 therapy appointments. I have co-facilitated more than 200 groups. And I am eternally grateful for my therapist, my psychiatrist, that they have the wherewithal and the desire and the extraordinary, unmatched compassion to hear me speak about my worst moments and my victories as well. And I can only imagine for they and also you what the cumulative effect of that and that ultimately you may move away from this profession that you were drawn to be part of. So what is self-care? I think, we think, well, okay, but I'm going to go get a massage, which is a beautiful thing, or I'm going to get my nails done. I had a pedicure for one of the first times recently. That's a beautiful thing. I felt like I was taking care of myself. So I'm kind of a fan of words, and let's look up the actual definition. So the practice of taking action to preserve or improve one's own health, the practice of taking an active role in protecting one's own well-being and happiness, in particular during periods of stress. Now, we come to you, we're not in a good place. Like I will now, after having so much therapy, I do often, not often, let's say I arrive and I tell my psychiatrist, who's a Jungian, so we talk about dreams, and my therapist, who's a licensed clinical social worker, we'll talk about the good days, but oftentimes I need to give air to my thoughts. And I know I'm not unusual in that way, that most of us who come into your presence, and then the folks who are at the policy level and handle the finances and the human resources, and just, I would imagine that you could be overwhelmed by the enormity of the problem, and that you maybe don't get a chance to see how, no matter what you do, no matter what part of the system that you play, you save lives. The people in your human resources department and financial management had as much to do with saving my life out here in California as it does for the person who sits down in the counseling rooms like with Dr. Dubin. It's no different. Everybody plays a part in that. And there's all types of self-care. There is. And it's very personal. I'm going to share with you what works for me, but it doesn't mean that my system will be exactly the one for you. So there's physical self-care, there's emotional self-care, there's social self-care, there's spiritual self-care, there's personal, there's space, there's finance, there's all these different things. The focus is on care of self. And it's interesting because I think what happens is, especially for professionals at your level of commitment in particular, that there may be a little bit of a misinterpretation of the golden rule. In other words, we are to treat someone else, to love thy neighbor as we love thyself. So I think actually the admonition in the golden rule, it's really a cry for self-care. Like, if we don't take care of ourselves, that cup is empty. I have nothing to give to you to potentially quench your thirst. And I think one of the most obvious ways to self-care is to take a nap. So this is the baby bear. So the bear came to us, he had what were called diabetic cataracts. So he really couldn't see, and he was so ridiculously cute. All the dogs lived in the house, by the way. Stop. It was really clean, I promise you. There's where my OCD was really kind of a benefit, like a little silver lining. People would come in and they'd lose their mind when they saw the baby bear. They'd be like, oh my God, he's so cute. So you need to take a nap. And if you think about it, I mean, I've had more than 65 dogs in my life that I've cared for. And you can't see, there is literally a deaf Boston Terrier on my lap right now named Heaven. Dogs are incredible at self-care. And dogs are very selfless. I could tell you way too many stories than I have time for, how dogs are so altruistic at their nature, but they also know that they need to take care of themselves. So this whole pedestal of self-care, it really is, the monster doesn't want to just destroy my mind. He wants to impact the physiology of who I am, and ultimately wants to feast on my soul like he would some delicacy, some high and wonderful expensive dessert. He wants to kill me. That's the monster's intention. And so because the condition impacts my body, my mind, and my spirit, what I've discovered is, and what I may humbly offer to you, for us to experience the wellness that is in our inalienable right, we must attend to the three components that make up for the whole of who we are. And there can be the creation of different self-care plans. And I'm just going to share with you mine. So for physical, it's about sleep. It's about diet. Now, I did a talk recently. I was in Texas, and the person looked at me and said, "You're a vegetarian, right?" And I'm like, "No, I'm not." And they said, "Oh, we thought all people in California were vegetarians." I'm like, I eat as well as I can, but Colonel Sanders, I don't know, somehow he got my cell phone number, and every once in a while he texts me, he says, I miss you. Come down and see me, please. The 11 herbs and spices are calling you. So it's diet, it's sleep, it's exercise, it's time outside. I see my therapist every week. I see my psychiatrist every month. And again, he's a Jungian, and we talk about dreams and archetypes and this. He helps me to understand. My therapist is a woman and my psychiatrist is a man. And so there's this great combination of energies, male and female. And then I take my meds, Lexapro and lamotrigine twice a day. And once a day, 2 pills once a day. And I do it with reverence and thanks, with the understanding, and these work well for me, that the best they're going to do is just quiet my symptoms. And I teach people this. I'm like, look, it's like the difference between an antibiotic and an Advil. We break our leg, we manage the pain, so we can go do the recuperative and healing practices inherent with PT and all the physical therapy and all those other things. The same thing is with an antidepressant, that it's going to quiet our symptoms so we can go embrace these things that truly are going to create new neural pathways, to leverage the aspect of neuroplasticity. So diet, sleep, exercise, counseling, psychiatry, medication, and then peer support. I mean, I think if there was a way that I could come to Maryland, and I will if you want, to replicate the support groups that I have been able to create as the result of great teaching that I have benefited from, I have seen transformations in people who don't do these other aspects of self-care that have literally saved their life just because they've been able to be in the presence of other people who walked a similar path. And one of the greatest acronyms of HOPE is this, that HOPE is hearing other people's experiences. There was a woman that came into one of the groups that I co-facilitated, and she was the most depressed soul I'd ever seen in my life. And with this group, we only met once a month for 2 hours. And after the third session, she came to me and the pastor who I was co-facilitating this group with, and she said, this group saved my life. And I've thought about that so much because she wasn't seeing a therapist. She wasn't taking medication because she had shared those things. And yet it was a group that was focused on support, not advice, unless somebody asked for advice. That she just had a chance to share and then listen, that it literally was saving her life. And I would love to offer the same possibility, that if there could be a behavioral support group for clinicians and physicians and people in this paradigm, because I think it could be so incredibly supportive if you can just listen to one another, because you will speak in the vernacular and in a way and from a point of experience that in hearing other people's struggles and victories, it can make all the difference in the world. But the other aspect of self-care may seem to be a little contradictory. Now, we've all, regardless of our professional capacity or we as a human being, the pandemic has realized that we've all suffered loss, horrific loss. But again, we tend to diminish it because, again, there's children starving in Africa, and the fact that I couldn't have my graduation in person, I couldn't go to my grandfather's funeral, it's not as significant, but loss is loss. And I like to distinguish loss and grief, because for me, they are not synonymous. Loss is the event, grief is the process to process the loss. Grief is actually not the enemy, but the problem is we're putting them together as synonyms. So people are adverse to embracing grief as the way to process loss. And most of you have probably read the great book by the magnificent Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen, who wrote the great book, Kitchen Table Wisdom. The doctor was a pediatrician who just could no longer be in the emotionless environment of medicine back in the day in New York. And so she became this amazing therapist and wrote this great book. And this quote, again, applies to you so beautifully, but underscores what I'm talking about, which she says, yet people who really don't care are rarely vulnerable to burnout. Psychopaths don't burn out. There are no burned out tyrants or dictators. Only people who care can get to a place of numbness. We burn out not because we don't care, but because we don't grieve. In my experience, burnout only really begins to heal when people learn how to grieve. Grieving is a way of self-care. the antidote to professionalism. And the first time I read this, I'm like, all right, doctor, I think you're kind of stretching. I'm like, no, you know what? You're exactly right. But we have to distinguish. Loss is the experience, grief is the process. And if we don't, and I'm sure you advise those of us who come into your presence that if we don't process loss, we're just going to we're going to be like this all the time, literally and figuratively, emotionally, spiritually. We're just, because we don't want to be hurt. And we need to embrace the fact that grief is the normal process of reacting in our strength. And we go to a personal trainer, I think, oh man, he's going to kick my butt. But when we're done, we feel better. Things are different. So grief is oftentimes the same thing. And oftentimes what we need in the processing of a grief is just a safe place. So this is Thomas. Thomas was one of 2 turkeys that came to the sanctuary. We had Thomas and Terry. And we had them for a little while. And then one day I went outside and I saw Thomas, but I didn't see Terry. And in all the years we did this sanctuary, it was the one and only time we lost a resident, as we called them, to a predator. At the end of that day, Thomas, the surviving brother, was close to this small horse trailer that we have, and he was raising a ruckus. He was expanding, contracting, like literally screaming. And I had no idea what to do. It didn't make any sense. But Deanna, my former beloved, so intuitive, knew something was wrong, obviously. And then she had this idea. So she went to the back of the horse trailer, laid down the ramp, walked back to Thomas, and then turned around, and Thomas followed her up and into the horse trailer, and then went completely quiet. Dee closed the ramp, stayed there. And Thomas spent the night there. And in the morning, we could hear him squawking again. We thought something was wrong, but Dee came and opened the ramp. And out he went. And for the next year, this was the routine, that every evening, Thomas would make his way to and then up into the horse trailer. We'd shut the ramp. He'd spend the night there. And in the morning, he would jump down and want to go be back out amongst all the other animals. And at the end of the year, there was an evening getting ready to put Thomas away, and I couldn't find him. And I'm like, oh my God, where's Thomas? Could he have also be taken in some way? But then I looked, and it's like he was with the other animals. And what I realized in all these years that Thomas had had enough time in that place, in that safe place, to grieve the loss of his beloved, and then he was okay. He didn't need to be there anymore. And I think love that story, because I think it parallels to us that it's not only a gift we can give ourselves, but it's a gift that we can give other people in helping them understand the difference, that grief is actually a mechanism. So those are the aspects of a self-care plan that I use, and you can use different ones. But one of the things that we have to do, if you have a plan, you got to put it in action, and it has to be a priority. There's lots of things to do. Life is too busy at this point, but we have to prioritize it. And I spend probably about as much time in self-care that a person does an average part-time job. Now, the basic reason of that is I'm more on the more extreme end of clinical depression. I have to manage my well-being. Part of that, the motivation comes from, if I make my way back to the bridge again, it could be a fateful trip. So I'm not going to go there anymore because I want to manage my self-care. And the realization is, and we hear this, but I really want you to take this in, that it really is the least selfish thing that you can do. That the realization that taking care of myself doesn't mean me first, it means me too. Now, if I get out of bed and just go jump into my day, I'm not going to be good. I'm not going to be any good to my fiance. I'm a new stepdad at 58 years old. I've never had children. And so now I have, help me, please. I have a 16-year-old, a 13-year-old, and a 10-year-old. And my dear God, very humbling. But I need to kind of like fortify myself before I go engage in this. So we have to prioritize. If I don't, I'm gonna be a mess. I'm gonna be a medical mess. I'm gonna be a hot mess. And the other thing we need to do is we have to accept two things. The first is we have to accept responsibility. Like there are times I would love to send maybe my fiance to my counseling appointment. Like, honey, could you please go and then just like, let me hug you and then I will embrace all the benefits that you've had with Barbara. Or could you please go see Dr. C? And here's the dream I want you to talk to him about and then let me know what he says. But that ain't gonna work. That we have to accept the responsibility. Like we've got to do the work. We got to put, and there are times, and you have told me as representative of your patients and the people that you serve, again, no matter what your role is, it's going to be work. Like it's going to be work. There are days that are going to be really, really hard. But the other thing, and I think this may be more slanted to you, is you've got to accept help from other people. And I would imagine, I'm not sure if I'm 100% right, but I do think I am, that given what your roles are in serving people like me, do you sometimes have a difficulty in asking for help on your own? Because you're like, well, I'm the healer, I'm the doctor, I'm the clinician, I work in behavioral health. Is it okay for me to have needs and wants and reach out a hand if I feel like I'm going under? And of course, the answer is yes. And the greatest illustration that I've ever witnessed about the willingness to accept help comes from a story shocking about a dog. So we had a Boston Terrier named Angel, and she had been left in an abandoned house for so long that her bladder atrophied. So 3 to 4 times a day, she would come find Deanna and I. And it was interesting that she had no shame. She didn't identify her condition that made her a less than of a dog. She just knew that she needed help. And so she sought out Dee and I, knowing that we would help her. And so we'd scoop her up and we'd bring her to the utility room and put her butt in the sink and her paws were up on the shelf. Now, when you manually express a female dog, you have to insert a catheter. It is a very invasive process. It's easy to put the tubing down the wrong channel. But each and every time that Angel was there, this literally is what she looked like. She was there and she closed her eyes and she just accepted the help that she knew that she needed. There was no resistance. Was it sometimes uncomfortable? Absolutely. Was it sometimes laborious? Absolutely. Did it sometimes hurt? Absolutely. Do we have to sometimes let go of the thought that, well, if I need help, if I attend to my care first, it's going to put me in a position where I feel less than? Sometimes that's the case. But the reality great model. That's why I love this image. And then it's all about consistency. As I say, the monster of mental illness hates consistency. I think he gets bored with us. Like, hey, dude, you're never going to miss a counseling appointment. Like, man, you're boring. But of everything, I think that the greatest tenet of self-care is connection. I'd say 3 most important words in mental health, thus self-care are connection, connection, connection. Connection creates hope. Hope saves lives from, not just in the literal sense, but from a life of despair, a life of stress, a life of fear, a life of tragedy, whatever it is. If we're connected with another human being, we're going to do exponentially better. And one of your own, the great Brené Brown, defines it in a way that is just, of course, Brené Brown-like and spectacular, that I define connection as the energy that exists between people when they feel seen, heard, and valued, when they can give and receive without judgment, and when they derive sustenance and strength from the relationship. Bingo. That's it. Like, who doesn't want that? Who doesn't need that? Who, in the presence of that, in the experience of that, is not going to feel better, look better, realize that we are worthy, that we have a place in this world, that we matter? And there's lots of different ways that we can connect. I teach people how to remember names, because we've all had the experience of what it feels like when someone remembers our name and we had no expectation. I teach people to leverage curiosity to arrive at the fertile level ground of understanding, giving people space to tell their story. First question out of the mouth of the first responder was, David, what does it feel like to be depressed? But I think that the good old-fashioned handwritten note, and again, we know this is true, is amazing. And I looked up, and I guess this is data, so forgive me. that there was a professor, is a professor from Kent State, who wanted to like empirically document, okay, does it really make a difference? Like he knew, yeah, it's good to be on the receiving end of a handwritten note, but does it benefit the author? And he said, yeah. And the last part is that the well-being increased significantly for the people who wrote the notes. And in a longer version, I don't have time today, but there are 2 different notes that made an enormous impact, one of which at the end of the note from a young woman who's like a daughter to me, in response to the knowing that sometimes what hurts me the most can't be seen. She said, depression can't have you because you're ours. We do all this, then what's the benefit? It's all this, all these different things. Like, even if we're not perfect in our self-care, and I'm not perfect, it's still, none of it's wasted. Like, okay, you know what? I only got to one side of the triangle. It's still good. But when we're really consistent and we're focused and we're determined and we can really embrace it, go to that very last one. It can save your life. It saves my life because I still have these days and I realized, okay, I got to get going. Let's give it as much as I can and I got to make connection. And I think when we do all these things, I think ultimately, what does it look like when we have prioritized our self-care, in the words of Dr. Dubin, when we put it on the pedestal? It looks like this. And this is Buddy. And I love this picture. Like, if you think, okay, what does mental health look like? It's that. And it's not just like, I feel good. For me, it's all is well and all will be well. Like, that's it. And I think this is, I know, this is what the just desserts. This is the rewards of doing all the work, going to the gym when we don't want to, making sure we make maybe more times than not, we make a particular dietary choice. Maybe those days when we don't want to meditate, we do. When we want to jump out of bed, but first it's better if we read. All those times when it's inconvenient, we don't feel like doing it, but we do it. This is what we get. And I think the great Zig Ziglar says, you don't pay the price for doing something, you get to enjoy the rewards. And I'm going to end quickly because this is important. I know I'm a little long, but if Dr. Whitfield and Dr. Dubin will bear with me, I just wanted to say one story. I can only imagine the difficulty that, especially for those of you on the front line who see the same patients coming through the system on a repeated basis, that there may be the question like, how is anything I'm doing working? And the same people, these incredible the heroes behind the scenes doing their magical work, like, it doesn't seem like it's making an impact. Well, let me tell you a quick story. So we had a parrot that came to the sanctuary named Kia, K-I-A, like the vehicle. Kia had been abused by a man. And so when Kia first came to the sanctuary and she caught sight of me, she lost it. Like, I've never seen a parrot scream and shake, and she'd go to the rear part of her cage. And I thought, whoa, okay. And I thought, well, I got good animal energy. So Kia had this cage on the top of an armoire and had this commanding view of the great room. And Dee really was she did the great things. I was good at feeding and picking up poop. And so I go up on that first day and to change the paper at the bottom of Kia's cage and then put in the water, the feed, and the nuts. But as soon as I approach the cage again, she loses it. And I put my hand in the cage. Now I'm nervous. She was about this big. She could have taken my fingers off, and she is just screeching. And so I handle it. Okay, you know what? It's going to be better tomorrow. You know what? I know how to do this. Second day, no difference. Second week, no difference. Third month, no difference. Now, I'll be honest, at that point, I lost all empathy. Like, it's not making a difference. Like, I'm doing everything I'm supposed to. I can't give more than I'm giving to this being, and it's not making a difference. She still is stuck in her trauma. So I said, Dee, honey, I'm done. I can't do it. And she said, no, but just please don't stop. I know it doesn't look like it, but you're making a difference. And I'm like, whatever. And so I keep going. And one day I come up and I'm robotic. Like, I really don't care. Like, whatever. Come to the cage. Kia does her thing. Like, all right. So, and like, not even looking. So I change the paper and then I hesitantly, on this day, actually, I like, go ahead, bite me. I don't care. So I go to put in the water and I do, and I put in the nuts and I go to put in the feed. And Kia all of a sudden became perfectly quiet. And she turned around and came and crawled up to the top of the cage and put her head down. for me to scratch it. I realize in this position, she's completely vulnerable. She can't strike me with her talon and she can't bite. And Dee got this, like took a picture of it. And the question becomes, of course, it was the latter. That's what happened. And so the bad news is, I don't think you get to see the benefit of all the small things that you do and all the acts of selflessness and the acts of grace and all that you give to people like me. But I'm here to tell you, to remind you to please believe me when I say it all makes a difference. And the people on that day, they didn't just save my life, that if I can get myself out of the way and to share my story in a way that it impacts somebody else, they impacted that person and it'll go on, not because of me, but because of you. And at this point, there are some resources that I have sent to Dr. Whitfield. These two links, this first one where I said there's always a story, it is a 4-minute video that underscores this, the aspect that we don't know, that what we see is not always the case. And the second one just is an amazing story about the power of a handwritten note. And I want to leave with one thing. And I think it's a reminder, and I end every speech this way in every training, this reminder of the crisis that we now face, the crisis that you are now battling. You were at the tip of the spear, but how each of us, no matter who we are and what we are and where we live, that we all have an ability to save lives. And this comes in the words from one of Dr. Dubin's contemporaries, Dr. Drew Ramsey, who's a psychiatrist. And this is what the doctor says, that someone you see today is thinking about killing themselves. Your smile, your question, your love could save them. Trust me, they told me it did. Thanks to you, we will win this war. And I can never thank you enough for all that you do. And at this point, I will step aside and bring it back to Dr. Dubin to ask any questions anytime. I will also give my number to Dr. Whitfield if anyone would ever like to speak to me, to hear more stories. I'm happy to share those.
All I can say is, wow, wow, wow. I'm just so blown away and inspired, and I could just listen to you for hours, and thank you. It really is reinvigorating. I want to share with you some of the questions from the Q&A. We'll see how many we can get through. The first is, what are inner boundaries for us to protect ourselves from psycho-emotional transfer, like secondary trauma that you spoke about, as we are exposed consistently to material that people are not exposed to in a normal life, so we can hold ground for our own normal life?
So if I hear, Dr. Dubin, what you're saying from the question is, it really goes back to Dr. Figley's quote of, you know, what can we do to insulate and protect ourselves from exposure to secondary trauma? And it was the second part of the question. Could you read the second part of the question? I think I heard it, but I just want to make sure I'm answering it correctly.
Yeah. And we're exposed constantly to materials that people are not normally exposed to. So how do we hold grounds for our normal life?
That's a great question. And without being redundant, I really think, and so, you know, we go to a medical doctor, Dr. Dubin, like you, and let's assume for a moment that you're not a psychiatrist, and we have some sort of injury. You would dress the wound, put Neosporin on it. But at one point you would tell us, okay, David, look, you have to give air to the wound. And I think my experience is, because issues related to mental illness are really disorders for the most part of the mind. And most of us who suffer from this are in the horrific place of isolation. So in answer to the question, it really is that I think the most powerful part, the greatest practice of self-care in response to this situation is to have at least one other person who can relate to your particular profession in this way that you can just share with, to just share, because you have to give air to your thoughts. If you don't, you know better than I, they're going to percolate, and ultimately in the worst case, and Dr. Whitfield had talked about this, they can become systemic and take somebody's life because you don't have any freedom from it. And there's a great quote from Dr. Remen that for peer support, for me, it's all about support, not advice. When Dr. Remen says that our listening creates a sanctuary for the homeless parts in another person. We're not talking about the literal fact of being homeless, but in the exposure to so much secondary trauma that most people are not exposed to, I think we can go back to a place that all we want to do is to tuck into a fetal position and just hope it will stop. But if we are in the presence of somebody that creates such a safe place for us to share, transformation can be extraordinary.
Yeah, I always say we're the affect sponge. The patients release all the emotion that's bothering them and we absorb it. Then we have to go home with all those emotions in us as a sponge. And you need a place to release that.
No, and I think it can be in the Army. They have this with the what they call, you have a battle buddy. And I actually think it would be, I just thought about it now, it'd be great in behavioral health that you have a battle buddy. That this is this person, this friend, this colleague, this somebody that can understand, and you just support one another. So I think be deliberate, be consistent. Say, okay, you know what, Dr. Dubin, I'm calling you every Tuesday and Thursday from 5 to 6 o'clock, and we're just going to share. And just do that. It can be, I've seen it hundreds of times what the transformation is, not just with mental illness, but with loss. The mere act of these support groups and having these individual battle buddies saves lives.
And for what it's worth, I actually do peer supervision and find it extremely helpful and encourage everybody to do that. It's really, really very helpful. Another question, great question also. It seems that with the intensity of the anger that we see every day on TV or hear over the radio, over mask wearing, vaccination mandates, the fraudulent election, it's, in quotes, is giving each of us a traumatic experience. Who sees these threats and violence on social media, and how do we deal with this?
You know, I think part of it, yes, and thank you for the way that question is phrased to the wonderful soul who phrased it, because I think you underscore the reality that trauma is trauma. It doesn't. I had the horror of being raped at 11 years old by a Boy Scout leader, and I've used EMDR and processed it. I'm good with it, and the only reason I mention it, I think, from a societal perspective, that is something that people could say, wow, that's traumatic. But the reality is what you just shared, and whomever this is, thank you, that trauma is trauma. It's everything. So I think in regards to the social media part, I think it becomes, quite frankly, a discipline of disconnecting from social media. You got to turn it off, because the reality is it's going to be there. But there's a great website. If you don't know it, you can download it on your app called the Good News Network. And it is fantastic. Just look at it. And it's just, and I put it on there because I'm tempted. You know, I can get into like, oh my gosh, what's going on? Like, I can't look at Yahoo. And I'm not condemning Yahoo, but there's not going to be a lot of uplifting stories on Yahoo. But I look at the Good News Network. So it really is a discipline to change and control the input that comes into our mind. We may need to have a period of sobriety from current events and current news and social media.
This is so wonderful, and we have so many good questions, but I need to do a few more housekeeping. So let me just remind everybody that one thing we'd like to ask of you is between now and the next webinar, which will be a while off because of Veterans Day and Thanksgiving, but to think about what actions you'll take between now and the next webinar to practice self-care. And if you want, you can even put it in the chat or the Q&A to sort of make it more real by committing to it. And also, and don't put this in the chat, but think about what loved ones or people there are in your lives that you wish they were here, or maybe you can encourage them to come to our next self-care webinar. And then I just want to mention the following things that you need to know. These recordings and slides will be on the BHA MedChi webinar webpage next week. Dr. Whitfield's going to put out the link. The upcoming webinars include on December 9th, coping with the behavioral impact of the pandemic, and November 11th, November 25th, and December 23rd, because of Veterans Day, Thanksgiving, and the winter holidays, respectively, there will be no presentations. We're still very committed to it. I also want to remind you about Maryland's 211 Press 1 crisis hotline. So if you are in crisis, you can call 211 or go to the website, https:/211MD. This will all be listed on the website. and you can receive help during your crisis. Don't be afraid to call. That's what we are here for. That's what it's there for. You can also opt in to get messages of helpfulness and wellness through the BHA sponsored text messaging service, MD Mind Health and MD Salud Mental. And again, these links will be put in by Dr. Wheatfield. And if you want weekly text messages, put in 898-211 or to MD Mind Health or to MD Salud Mental, depending on the language. CME is provided for physicians, but CUEs are not. All non-physicians can get a participation certificate. The Maryland Board of Social Work, unfortunately, does not accept this certificate for continuing education. And I apologize for all that wordy housekeeping, but I want to make sure we get through that. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Let me just grab a couple in no particular order because they're all so great, but I love this. Powerful presentation. Where do you get the courage to speak up?
No, I'm unusual. My family would say really unusual in that the system worked beautifully for me. Like the system of care here in Placer County has just been amazing. My time in the psych ward was extraordinary. Not to just well, anyway, I could go on forever. My family didn't run away from me; they ran towards me. And now I know my story is unusual. That unfortunately it's probably more rare than common, where one soul could have that so much support once people knew what was happening. So, in answer to the question, I see it as my job to really let people know that it's possible to survive, that there are indeed people just like all of you who are out here to help us. That it would be the epitome of selfishness if I kept all the stories about all the people and all the things that they have and continue to do to myself, if I kept those to myself. And so I want to share. I want to let people know, if I can just give people just the smallest little aspect of hope, I'm like, I promise you it can be better. To remind people that you have survived 100% of your worst days and just get through this next one. It's okay to ask. There are angels out there in ways that you cannot even imagine.
You are getting a lot of thank yous for your willingness to be vulnerable and to share. And I sometimes think that one of the things that we don't do is disclose to other people that we're struggling also. And so people look around and like, oh, she's got it together and her life is perfect or his life is perfect. And they don't realize that we also have had that difficult patient or that stressor or that grief or that loss that you have alluded to. And I think that there's a lot of appreciation being expressed for your openness. We're going to have to wrap up shortly. A couple of people have asked if you'd like to provide your email for further questions.
Yes, in fact, so Dr. Dubin, on one of the Q&As, I did a response. So if you look in the answer, okay, yes. So maybe to Dr. Whitfield, I will send my email address, and then I will also send my personal cell phone. Please call me. I'm not. And if anybody wants me to come out to Maryland, I'm happy to come out. I can send information on. The talk I do most is the why of suicide and the how of hope. So it's a much longer story, and there are animal stories in there too. I promise. What I do is I wrap mental health in animal stories, because I think it gives people safe proximity, but there's also a teaching point, like the story about Thomas. Like, we just need a safe place.
I invite all our wonderful participants to really take it to heart and think about what they will do before the next time to put that self-care on a pedestal, because I like the quote that self-care is not about putting me first, but putting me, finish the quote. But self-care is really important. And I think it's intuitively not easy for healthcare providers to ever practice self-care. They're always about taking care of everyone else. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And I want to wish you continuing success and good health on your journey. And we appreciate your being here today. And we look forward to participating in further conferences with this wonderful group.
Thank you, everyone. You are amazing.